Imagine a future where you can slip almost seamlessly between the real and virtual worlds, where actions you make in the virtual world can impact the real world, including crimes. Welcome to Gamedec, a point-and-click role-playing adventure game where you play as a game detective, solving crimes and mysteries in both the real and virtual worlds. The game is inspired by a collection of short stories by Polish science fiction author Marcin Przybylek that portray the life of a game detective or Gamedec. But will this cyberpunk-esque, isometric mouse button clicker quench your thirst to crack the cases and lay down the law on some pixel-formed punk-ass bitches?
Alright, enough bullshitting around.
Or will failure after failure of cases have you rage quitting a game within a game? Not entirely sure how that would work.
What a fucking ripoff. I spent so much money on this shit.
Either way, we've broken our mouse buttons on this point-and-click, massive dialogue reading detective game so you don't have to. My name's Dav and welcome to D&DGaming. Joining me to crack the case and understand what the f*** went on in this game is my brother Dale. So what are your first thoughts on Gamedec?
Well, this was a new one to me as I hadn't heard of it before, but I do like point-and-click style RPGs and the futuristic cyberpunk setting certainly stood out to me. Got to be honest, I didn't have the highest expectations given that it was free on the Epic Store and I'd never heard of this developer before, but luckily it became obvious early on that this wasn't just another low-effort cash grab internet cafe simulator.
Yeah, so for me, I'd not heard of this game before, so I wasn't sure what to expect going into it. I didn't look into the game before starting, so it was completely fresh to it. We've reviewed quite a few point-and-click adventure games on our channel, but as this was only released in 2021, this is the most modern game in the point-and-click genre that we've reviewed, so it's interesting to see how this stacks up against the others.
So in terms of graphic options, well, the options are quite limited in this one, so don't expect too much tweaking beyond the basics.
Yeah, as Dale's pointed out, it's very limited to a handful of mainly shadow detail, anti-aliasing and bloom settings. In terms of graphics and graphics performance, our PC specs are up on screen as usual, but the game ran well on my PC. I ran the game with the very few graphic options available on the highest quality settings and didn't notice any major graphical issues. The graphics are quite good generally. I wouldn't say they're up there with the best in terms of isometric games, but there's some nice environments with decent textures and lighting. There was certainly nothing that stood out to me as bad in terms of graphics, more middle of the road, I guess.
Despite the limited graphic options, the graphics themselves actually look okay in my opinion. It does have a top-down perspective and so there's not much in the way of close-up shots, but they captured the futuristic setting well. The lighting in particular stood out to me as a positive, and I also like the hand-drawn art style used for the characters when you speak to them. The game ran well for me on a mix of normal and very high settings, some of which I tweaked early on to go for smoothness over quality. So in terms of player controls, this is a game that is predominantly played with a mouse due to its point-and-click nature, but there are also some keyboard shortcuts shown in the options menu which allows for using some shortcuts to save on those clicks.
Yeah, so the controls are typical point-and-click isometric, really, nothing much else to say here. You can also use the keyboard for a few functions, but it's mainly a mouse button-wearing point-and-click game. The keyboard buttons that can be used for some of the functions in the game can't be rebound in the settings either, which is a shame.
I'm out of fucking order.
So in terms of game modes, there's only one main game mode. You play as a game detective, or Gamedec for short, based in the city of Warsaw in an unknown time in the future. You switch between the real world known as Realium and the game world known as Virtualum via a couch VR type system, and your job is solving crimes that have been committed in both the worlds. The crimes and mysteries that you attempt to solve are interlinked and interwoven into the wider story, so many of the characters you will meet feature many times throughout the game. The game's progression system is based on irreversible decisions and deductions you make throughout the game, and these drive the narrative and change the outcomes of situations.
As you take on new cases and start your investigation, you need to gather clues, interview witnesses, and analyse the evidence. You'll also make moral choices that will impact the outcome of the case and the wider world around you. The game features a branching narrative with multiple endings for each case. The choices you make throughout the game will determine which path you follow and how the story unfolds.
I'm getting used to seeing you around here.
So in terms of game mechanics, you select your character at the beginning, choosing from a range of pretty terrible looking character models, most of which look basically the same. So where the screen shows 18 people, in reality there's only about 8 different character models, just with different skin or hair colour. You name your character, choose where you originate from, which is basically your class status set around low, middle or high city, your values, and lastly your pronoun. Of course you do in 2023, where would we be if we didn't have a pronoun option? There are two different difficulty modes to choose from, normal mode and true detective mode. Normal mode is taking cases, finding witnesses, looking for clues, etc., and you save the game anytime. True detective mode is a harder, more focused mode, saving only between levels and is for more experienced players. You begin by waking in your apartment and using point and click mechanics, move around looking for items to interact with. These are indicated by a hovering icon when in close proximity. You select the icon and typically faced with a number of options to choose from. When interacting with NPCs, the choices you make and how you interact with them determines not only how they respond, but can affect how the game is driven forward and the outcomes that precede the choice you make. There's a skill tree in the game which allows you to improve your player's attributes related to deduction and aids you in making decisions. As you speak to NPCs, dependent on the outcomes of the conversation, you earn points which help you unlock various skills. You take on jobs and these are accessed from the computer in your apartment. A typical job will involve entering one of the in-game games via a VR couch and exploring the environment, whilst talking to NPCs and gathering information about the case you are working on. As you gather info, this will be added to your deduction screen accessed by an icon in the UI. The deduction screen allows you to select an outcome for any given situation and will in turn open up other avenues of inquiry and lines of dialogue to explore. Once a case is complete, you typically find yourself coming out of the virtual and back into realism, usually in your apartment. So in terms of UI, the UI is very simple, but does differ slightly between the real and virtual worlds. In both the real and virtual worlds, you have three icons to the left of the screen: deduction, codex, and professions. Deduction leads you to a screen that populates as you gather information on the job you have and aids you by providing the information in one place that can be reviewed before selecting which decision you wish to make. The codex screen splits into tabs that give you info on characters you meet, in-game organizations, technologies, and info about aspects of realism and virtualism. The professions screen is your skills tree. Also, in both the real and virtual worlds, you get a dialogue box and character to the lower center of the screen and a quest log to the right of the screen. In the virtual worlds, depending on which game you are logged into, you get a different set of icons and bars at the top of the screen. Typically, these include ammo for your weapon if you have one, times you've died, and money collected. Generally, I've found the UI to be pretty intuitive and functional and gives you all that you need.
I quite like the simple UI in this one, and they again did quite a good job of capturing the futuristic feel in the icons in particular. It was simple, unobtrusive, and had a nice style to it. So in terms of the sound and music, well, the music for me didn't stand out in either a good or a bad way. It was somewhat suitable to the detective genre, but also felt a largely generic soundtrack. It's mostly a mix of electronic and orchestral type music, but I feel there was definitely room for improvement here. In terms of environmental sounds, I thought these were a bit lacking at times as well. I noticed on some levels there was a distinct lack of general environmental sounds, and instead there was just the music playing in the background. This left a slightly empty feel to the game world at times. Given how well they captured the futuristic setting with the graphics and level design in places, this was a bit of a letdown.
Yeah, so for me on sound and music, I thought the music was quite good. It's typically quite orchestral, as Dale's pointed out, for the most part. It works well with the themes of the game and does well to set the suspense in the game also. The environment sounds were okay, nothing stood out particularly good or bad for me.
Add me to your friends, partner.
The general sound of clicking icons and switching menus are all okay. There was very little voice acting in the game, but where it did come in on occasion, I thought it was quite good. Certainly no particularly bad voice acting, in my opinion.
Hey boss, that Gamedec is here.
So in terms of bugs and glitches, I didn't come across any that I noticed.
Although I noticed some early reviews of the game picked up numerous bugs, I assume many of these were patched out, as likewise I certainly didn't experience any in my playthrough.
Ride the wave toward the truth. Or fly to enlightenment, or something.
So to sum up, things I liked about the game. I like the way the individual stories of each crime or mystery that you have to solve are interlinked and intertwined into the bigger story of the overarching corporations and the organisations that runs the virtual game worlds. And the more you solve, the deeper the story gets. The overall story is interesting, very fitting in terms of online VR games and the future of gaming. and virtual worlds becoming more and more engrossing. Combined with the crime element, I felt this was quite a good basis for a game. The characters are sometimes difficult to get a hold on, and I found myself believing them on their stories as I grilled them, but then changing my mind later once more info was available on the case. So it's well put together and has you second guessing at times, and keeps you on your toes when you're trying to solve the cases. The game has so many different outcomes in any given situation and in its overall ending that it has a high level of replayability. Some of the environments were cool, looked good graphically, and were well designed.
In terms of things I liked about it, I like the general futuristic cyberpunk vibe of the game, and although arguably this genre has been overdone in the last few years, I feel the devs captured it quite well here in the graphic style in particular. I thought it had an interesting concept of essentially a game inside a game, and I haven't really played anything quite like this before. It was quite unique in this aspect. There's decent replayability due to the varied skill tree, and so no two playthroughs will be the same. Branching choice system allows for different styles of playthrough, and the outcome of a case can vary massively depending on your choices and how many clues you're able to find on any given level. This allows for a lot of freedom in your playthrough.
So in terms of things I didn't like about the game, there's far too much dialogue to read in this. It became too much after hours of playing, and I found myself skipping large bits of text and pushing my way through to get to the end, doing this from far too early in the game. Story, although as said it is interesting, it became lost on me in places due to the sheer level of reading of text required in order to progress the game. I found it hard to get my head around how the skills tree helped as well. It just wasn't noticeable enough in the way that it's implemented. It sometimes opens up additional lines of questioning or options that you can choose, but these don't always work and don't necessarily give you an advantage as a skills tree typically would. For example, if you're trying to access info from a drone, if you have the hacker skill, you can hack the drone, but this won't necessarily be an advantage as it might actually cause a different set of situations to occur that don't help, but you don't know until you try. But once you've tried, it may shut the drone down, so the additional information that could have been gathered by choosing a different option is no longer available, and you would have been better not having that skill and selecting another option to access the drone. I feel like the skills tree could have been implemented in a better way that makes a more advantageous outcome a certainty to make it more worth you unlocking any particular skill.
In terms of things I didn't like, I can't help but feel that due to the timing of when this game came out, it was somewhat riding off the back of the cyberpunk genre following the release of Cyberpunk 2077 in 2020. There's a feeling this was rushed through in order to capture some of the audience that was let down with the initial release of Cyberpunk. There are some noticeable typos in the text, and some of the dialogue doesn't seem to really make much sense, which I suspect is an issue with getting lost in translation as the developer is Polish along with the source material. It feels like the English translation was rushed for sure. There is just far too much text to read. Don't get me wrong, I've played games like Pillars of Eternity and Fallout 1 and 2, which are heavily text-based and take a lot of reading. But with the translation issues, this game was near tedious at times, and I found myself actually skipping some text, which I hate doing as I'm usually a completionist with games. Tying a little into the heavy text was the slow pacing at times, and also the game's world can feel a little empty, with most of the interaction being with the NPCs rather than the game world itself.
So Dale, what do you think on scores for this one?
Overall, I thought it was a mostly enjoyable RPG with a great setting and a branching narrative which allows for high replayability. The focus on dialogue and exploration is refreshing, but the translation issues made it tough to sit through at times. It certainly has its fair share of flaws, and you really have to be in the mood for reading lots of text. Fans of detective games and narrative-driven experiences should mostly enjoy it, but don't expect anything outstanding here, so I'm giving it a 7 out of 10.
So for me, Gamedec is not a bad game by any stretch of the imagination. Its deep story combined with its intertwined deductive narrative makes for a really strong base to the game. I just felt that its execution is where the game falls down. With such a complex story and unravelling narrative, this really needed to be told to the player rather than read in text form. It would have been far more engaging if the dialogue was all voiced, and where they had good voice acting coming in places, I don't see why they couldn't have gone the whole hog and voiced it all. It would have been worth it. This combined with the crazy level of mouse clicking required to go through the dialogue really reduced my enjoyment of the game and subsequently my scoring. So balancing the good and the bad, I'm giving Gamedec a 7 out of 10. Well guys, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe and comment. Hit that bell icon to be notified when we upload a new video, and we'll see you in the next one.
Checkmate, motherfuckers!
What a fucking ripoff. I spent so much money on this shit.